This is an excerpt from the book Return to Essence, How to Be in the Flow and Fulfill Your Life's Purpose, which I wrote in 2007. The information in it is very much in keeping with the teachings from Jesus that I've been bringing through more recently. When we make a choice, sometimes it's spontaneous and not thought about, like when we jump out of bed in the morning. At other times, the options are laid out, examined, and decided on. These are two different experiences of choosing. One just happens, and one is a decision. Decisions come from the mind. A decision is the result of making up your mind, an interesting turn of phrase. To the ego, questions feel like problems that need to be solved by making a decision. There's a feeling of needing to make a decision, and almost any decision will do. To the ego, making a decision is important because that ends the discomfort of not knowing. You make up your mind. You make it up. The ego wants to know, and it wants to know now. It has no patience with not knowing. Its job is to know, even if it doesn't, even if it's impossible to know. The ego is determined to know, to decide, and to give answers. Its very existence depends on knowing, because if you stop turning to the mind for answers, the ego can't thrive. If you catch on that the mind doesn't know the answers to most of your questions, the ego is doomed. So the ego fakes it. It makes up answers. The ego doesn't believe there is a right time to make a decision. To it, the right time is always now. It needs to know now. Not knowing something seems wrong, so the ego needs to make questions go away as soon as possible. How can you not know where to live, what you want to do for a living, what to eat for dinner, where to go on vacation? In the egoic state of consciousness, not knowing produces shame, and the longer you don't know, the more incompetent or inadequate you feel. Because of the urgency to know, the ego has developed many strategies for knowing. Asking others is a primary one. What do you think? We just go with someone else's answer. Research can be a variation on this. We research what others have chosen and what they have to say about that choice. That strategy seems less risky and more intelligent than just asking someone else. Then there's more serious research. We study the subject and draw conclusions from that. We list the pros and cons and then decide. The mind uses information to make decisions. That way of making decisions has its place, depending on the question. If you're trying to decide what flowers to send your aunt, asking your cousin what your aunt likes might be helpful. Or if you need flowers that will last especially long for a bouquet you're putting together, research will tell you that. However, other questions aren't as suitable to asking others or doing research. Do I send flowers to my sick aunt, or do I go visit her? How do you decide something as simple as this? How are questions like those answered? And what about the bigger questions? Who and when to marry, whether and when to have children, what career to have, where to live? The egoic mind, the voice in your head, pretends to have answers even to the bigger questions. If we ask the mind, it will give us an answer, or at least tell us how to find one. In the egoic state of consciousness, we turn to the mind for answers because we may not recognize any other possibility. It seems like we're the one running our life, so we feel like we have to choose. Since we see ourselves as the one who's thinking, we assume that our thoughts are what we think, so we do what we think. The egoic mind tells us to do something, and we do it. We don't even think to question our thoughts because we're programmed not to. That's what we think. End of story. In the egoic state of consciousness, the answer is whatever we think it is, and if someone disagrees, we argue our position because that's what we think. Our programming causes us to make certain choices, and those choices create our life, until they don't any longer. Our life is dominated and shaped by the choices we make from the egoic state of consciousness, until we begin to wake up out of the trance created by our programming. We begin to awaken to our true nature, or essence, and allow it to move us in life, which it does through our intuition and through motivation, urges to act, excitement, and joy. Essence, our essential self, or true self, is co-creating our lives with our ego. It allows the egoic mind to have the influence it does, all the while it's offering other choices, other possibilities than what the mind may be offering. We're free to follow what we think or to follow those other possibilities. Those possibilities may not be immediately obvious, however, because they aren't usually introduced through the mind, but arise in the moment. The greatest interference to becoming aware of possibilities other than what the mind is presenting is making another choice too quickly. The impatience of the ego often results in quick decisions that may take us somewhere other than where essence would have taken us. To discover where essence wants us to go, we may have to wait for the answer to arise in its own time. When it's time, the answer arises spontaneously out of the moment, and we often act on it just as spontaneously. When knowing does finally happen, it happens all of a sudden, but it may take days, weeks, months, or even years to get to that point. Knowing shows up all of a sudden, but we can't predict when that will be. We just have to wait for it, and the ego doesn't want to wait. When a sudden knowing happens, you know it because of how it feels. There's a sense of relaxation, relief, peace, elation, a yes about a choice. Gone is all confusion, resistance, and doubt about what to do. It's clear and obvious. You know. That knowing feels solid, real, and unshakable, unless and until the egoic mind comes in and creates its usual confusion. When a decision is made from the egoic state of consciousness, the experience is a very different one. There isn't the same relief, relaxation, or peace about it. The mind usually continues to think about it. Did I make the right decision? What if? Maybe I should. The mind has decided, but that doesn't end the deliberation. A lack of peace around a decision is a sign that it was made by the mind. In the flow, decisions arise, they aren't made, and they stick, while in the egoic state of consciousness, they're frequently changed. There's a big difference between thinking and then deciding, and not knowing and then suddenly knowing. The difference is that no thinking is involved in suddenly knowing. That's a big difference. It might be hard to imagine life without making decisions, but life goes much better when we wait for clarity to arise rather than make a decision before then. There is wisdom behind providing clarity when it's provided, and no sooner. We learn to trust the wisdom of the moment, of the flow. Rather than pushing the river by choosing before it's time to choose, we wait, listen, and trust that we will know when it's time to know, and no sooner. Essence operates on a need-to-know basis. We will know when we need to know, and not before. To discover what Essence is choosing, you will have to be quiet and listen. Listening will bring you into the moment and into the flow, where choosing is spontaneously happening and has been happening all along. These choices feel like choiceless choices. Essence will create quite a different life than the ego if you let it, although many things will be similar. Essence will express the same talents the ego did, but it will do it more skillfully, fluidly, and powerfully. Essence will express itself through the same personality the ego did, but it will do it more positively, without selfishness. Essence will still be faced with the challenges and karma of your particular body-mind, but it will handle them more gracefully and turn them into strengths. Essence may continue to make many of the same choices your ego made. It may choose to remain in the same relationships, the same job, and the same location, or not. The shift from ego to essence may or may not result in changes in the structures of your life. But whatever changes are made will be more satisfying and fulfilling. The best way to describe the experience of essence choosing is to say that choosing just happens. It doesn't feel much like a choice, which involves thinking and implies deciding between options. Essence chooses when we're not thinking. It chooses in between our thoughts. The choice pops into our mind or is expressed spontaneously through action, but we didn't arrive at it through thinking. When Essence chooses, we know because the choice appears in our mind or body, and usually, hopefully, we don't spend time mulling it over. That choice seems obvious and right, and that's that. The experience is so different from how the ego makes a decision that recognizing it is very easy once we see it as a valid way of choosing. The mind will tell you that you need to think about the choices that Essence makes. The mind will doubt them and try to confuse you with more thoughts, if you let it, because the ego doesn't want to be out of a job. Its job is to think and decide, and that's all it knows how to do. The ego doesn't trust any other way of doing things, and when you're identified with the egoic mind, either do you. However, when you've had enough experiences of Essence choosing and the fulfillment that comes from that, you begin to trust it and allow it to happen more and more. Allowing is the key to being in Essence and in the flow. Allowing requires receptivity rather than reactivity, which is the ego's style. The ego is always reacting to life, taking action. When we're in the flow, allowing precedes action. We allow motivation, insight, ideas, and inspiration to arise, and then we act on them. In the egoic state of consciousness, those impetuses for action from Essence are often ignored. Instead, the ego makes up a reason for action and acts. When we're in the flow, we move back and forth between being receptive and being active. Our actions are based on motivation and ideas that arise out of the moment, which aren't related to thought. Thought might be helpful in implementing action at some point, but thoughts aren't the reason for taking action. There's an ease about actions that are rooted in Essence because they're uncomplicated by the confusion of the mind. When we're simply acting and not questioning that action or trying to manipulate life with it, Actions feel clean, free of ego, clear, and fulfilling. Actions that come from essence, regardless of what they are inherently rewarding because they contribute to fulfilling the purpose of our life. Even very simple, ordinary actions can bring great joy and satisfaction when they're in service to essence and our life purpose. We don't have to be in the flow constantly for the flow to make a difference in our life. By meditating, just being quiet, or doing other enjoyable activities that bring us into essence for a little while every day, such as hiking, running, biking, gardening, dancing, singing, painting, journaling, or playing or listening to music, we invite essence to co-create with us. When we do things that evoke essence, we will receive the insights and guidance we need to live much more peacefully and happily, even if we spend much of the rest of the time identified with the ego.